This episode, I'm joined once again by Sophia Howlett to discuss the work of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, alongside discussions on Ficino, God, the Kabbalah, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast or just keep everything running, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Sophia Howlett, thanks very much once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
My pleasure, James. It's lovely to be back.
We are going to be discussing the work of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who most people will probably just know as Pico, from your book Re-evaluating Pico, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2021, who I should say at the start were kind enough to send me the digital copy of the book, so thanks very much to Palgrave Macmillan. And the full title, Re-evaluating Pico, Aristotelianism, Kabbalism and Platonism in the philosophy of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. So as you can imagine, this is a work tackling Pico, but pretty much immediately it's also tackling Ficino, because I noticed as I was reading your book, you basically, from about the second page, were like, okay, we can't. There's no. Would you say, just to begin this discussion, would you say there is pretty much no way you can discuss Pico without some way discussing Ficino?
I think that my book makes the case that an awful lot of people in the past have tried to discuss Pico without discussing Ficino. I kind of label this as Pico studies, and that was really, really weird to me, because coming to Pico from the perspective of Ficino and the academy, it was obvious that Pico was, needed to be understood in juxtaposition to Ficino. But then there's this whole world out there of Pico criticism that just ignores the existence of Ficino. So what I've tried to do in the book, and what I would definitely espouse moving forward, is something that kind of comes between the two. I mean, we recognize now that Pico is not the kind of acolyte of Ficino that maybe some people wanted to project him as being, but he's also not some standalone figure that you can ignore within the intellectual context in which he was working and living. And that definitely means, from a Platonic perspective, Ficino. I also would say, though, that, when I started writing the book on Ficino, I saw it as the first of a trilogy. And something that I really wanted to develop as I moved into the book on Pico was that kind of comparative context, so that I was not only building the reader's understanding of a particular person in a particular place, but also their broader understanding of the intellectual context, and then be able to compare and contrast between these different thinkers to get a bigger sense of what might be the issues, what is at stake when we talk about Renaissance philosophy. So that comparative piece is always there. And in fact, now I feel like it needs to be taken so much further, because there's so little work of really comparing the two. And there's some really interesting things to be talked about, particularly, and I talk about this in the book, particularly the way in which Pico constantly takes on Ficino, in terms of debate and in his work. It's a deliberate challenge throughout.
So what talking about that, understanding the context and making sure that the scholarship is there to ground the context, what sort of presumptions do you think we're often dragging into Renaissance philosophy, which might sort of lead us astray, so to speak?
Well, I think several come to mind. In the first one, and this is something that we discussed in the context of Ficino, is humanism. Because there is this attempt to stamp everybody who does philosophy in the Renaissance as humanists, and putting them within that overall context of anybody like Erasmus, who, the religious reformer, who is usually seen within this kind of under this stamp of Northern humanism, of which I'm assuming we would think of as Pico and Ficino as being Southern humanism somehow. And I would definitely reject that. And that also puts them in the line of kind of Petrarch onwards. And so it's a kind of like a grand narrative of what the Renaissance is, which is this thing which is about rebirth, that it comes from Petrarch. And it is also about rebirth, which puts Latin Europe back on track after this nasty period that the Petrarch calls the Dark Ages, back on track towards the modern. And therefore, we are not only seeing these folks as humanists and part of rebirth, but we are also seeing them as proto-modern. So in other words, that their value lies in what they, how they bring us towards modernity. And so there's a lot of kind of lenses being looked backwards, you know, from a kind of like post-Kantian world to folks like Pico and Ficino, and trying to find those pieces of the modern. Otherwise, people are kind of rejected and set aside, which is why I think that Pico was very much the kind of philosopher du jour. And even though Ficino's ideas are in many respects more influential, I think people found him more problematic because he was more difficult to put into some sort of particular box as modern, whereas Pico gave some openings in that regard. I would say another thing that where we make mistakes is by assuming a similar religious lens, and that's something that you mentioned yourself. That, you know, the world of the 15th century is a very, very different world. It is, there are different social forces at work. There are some things that we find similar that may distract us, like, for instance, something that really comes to the fore in Pico and Ficino's work is that sense of an ending, a teleological perspective. And that is something that we recognize from today. But is our own view, our own sense of a teleological, living in a teleological era, is it the same as it was at the end of the 15th century? That's something that one would have to really get into and debate, and sounds like a great idea for a book, by the way.
But those books are always so difficult because ultimately you're no longer really doing sort of scholarly textual work. You're to actually, you know, you're trying to imbue an actual mindset, which is so difficult because you have to start with really like a purgation of presumptions which you don't even see in yourself.
Yes, and to make it more difficult, a lot of the kind of theorizing in the 20th century and 21st century around how to do that is based on modern ideas of perception. So, for instance, you know, we might immediately go to Gadamer and, you know, his idea of hermeneutics, you know, and kind of the historic horizon. But it is, you know, hermeneutics itself is based on a very, very post-Kantian notion of perception and being. So that doesn't work.
Well, jumping in with Pico, I believe, you know, historically, and if we were to historically situate him when drawing in some biography, I guess to do so, really, we would begin with what you call the Pico Myth, which is around his biography. So what is this myth, and what's the truth of it?
Oh Lord, if I knew the truth. So the Pico Myth was really put together by his nephew Gianfrancesco and his heir as well. And Gianfrancesco put together this story about a miraculous mind, and who is also this brilliant prince. And the brilliant prince piece was definitely there during his lifetime. People would talk about, you know, the young genius coming into town, you know, surrounded by all the accoutrements of nobility, and how his mind was brilliantly penetrating and how he wowed everybody with his memory, etc. And Gianfrancesco adds on the layers of miracles, and so does Ficino as well, that somehow this was, you know, Ficino almost portrays him as some sort of Christ-like figure coming in, that, you know, that he had been prophesied Ficino is the father, Pico is the son. If I'm going to push that one far, but there's certainly a kind of an element of weirdness around that. So Gianfrancesco also talks up the idea that, Pico was saintly, that he wanted to give away all of his goods, that he wanted to live an ascetic life, that he was a great church reformer, but he was within the church. He wasn't really a heretic, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the pieces, the Pico myth, that then go on from Gianfrancesco's publication of Pico's work and also his writing of this life that went with the first edition of Pico. And this was actually taken up. Particularly, we know of Thomas More, and Thomas More he actually was really into the life of Pico as produced by Gianfrancesco, and he even conveyed prayers around the life to his daughter, as a kind of a symbol of the pious life and, the things that she should be focusing on in her own spirituality. And so we do have this idea of Saint Pico, as we call him. But that was so devotional literature around Pico was really prominent from Gianfrancesco onwards. So what was the truth? Well, I don't know about any miracles around his birth or anything. There's a lot of myth making. Was Pico as brilliant as people talked about him as being? I'm not sure, to be honest. And I have to kind of check myself here because there's the feeling throughout Pico, not only those who presented him afterwards, but the way in which he self-fashioned himself during his lifetime. There is a kind of there is a certain level of elitism that goes on. And also he does not recognize the work of the people around him, supporting all the activities he has. And I guess one also has to question, if he hadn't been a prince and a nobleman with a ton of money, would everybody have gone on about how great he was? So
I was going to say this. I mean, you see this a lot in this era as well with, often when people look to bring in, someone else where this sort of political and cultural changes, or the politics especially, and the culture especially regarding money and honor and these virtues of the time. Machiavelli, I mean, people rarely comment the fact that The Prince was written, in light of the Medicis, and there was this, dare I say it, culture of brown nosing. And this, and in this era especially is rife with it. The idea of the great polymath as well, of these very individualistic figures. And so, as a scholar of this, is it often difficult to push through that sort of veil of elitism and sort of see, how good were you really?
Yes, it is. And it's particularly difficult because once you recognize what's going on, it's very, very hard to kind of disconnect from that. And that goes back to what we were just saying about the modern perspective, right? That you understand what's going on, and that shouldn't take away from Pico's brilliance, but it does bring a certain kind of like, oh God, to the whole thing, that you feel you have to strip that away a little bit. I worry about getting that balance right. I think it's very, very tricky with Pico, getting the balance right between a kind of a reverence for his work and his reputation, which was exceptional in terms of, what he managed to do and think about, and the impact he had, given that he died at such a young age. But at the same time, recognizing that there's a hell of a lot of hyperbole around his work. And because people don't point it out, somebody needs to be the person to point it out. And somebody needs to say, the guy's an exceptionalist, he is very elitist, and he's also a patron And, I don't know about you, but when I need to do something in a language that I don't know, I have to go and learn the language and then work through translating it, or hope like hell that some nice person might come along and do a nice, translation. But even then, you've got to look at the original. Pico had people doing it for him. That doesn't mean to say he didn't want to also learn the language. It just meant that he was able to speed up a lot of the things that he was able to do. He had an entourage around him who was supporting him in his studies. So, as I said, I kind of worry about going too far one way or the other. And I really, really want to create that middle road that recognizes there's a lot of hyperbole here, but at the same time, the guy is really, really interesting, has really did attempt an extraordinary and very original project, and has left behind, despite the young age at which he died, a considerable oeuvre in terms of getting your teeth into some interesting scholarship.
So you mentioned, he dies at a young age. I mean, what if we were to give a short overview of what his life looked like? What are we looking at here?
So, born near Ferrara, to a sort of minor nobleman family, but with a ton of money, which caused a lot of disruption amongst his brothers because they fought over the inheritance. But he got a sizable sum himself, which means there must have been a lot of money because he was the youngest son of three. He was sent off to become a canon, to study canonical law at Bologna. I guess in a way, lucky for him and his studies, this was his mother's wish. His mother died, and he set off on a kind of a pilgrimage, shall we say, an intellectual journey around some of the great universities and philosophers of the period in order to pursue his own intellectual interests. So he started off by going to the University of Ferrara. He was very friendly and had familial connections with the Estes in Ferrara, and they were always almost like a second home for him. And then after Ferrara, he went up to Padua, which of course at the time was the home of Aristotelianism. We can debate whether it was Averroan Aristotelianism or a kind of Aristotelian revival at that time. He became very friendly with folks like Nifo and Vernier, who led the revival of Aristotelianism and a return to text. He also became friendly with a Jewish Aristotelian Averroan philosopher called Medigo, Elijah del Medigo, who he worked with off-site from the University of Padua. These people all later became good friends, colleagues, maybe sometimes part of his entourage, particularly Medigo. He also became friendly with Barbaro, who was a major humanist voice, also an Aristotelian. And one of his first published works, it wasn't written to be published, but one of his first works that you see in his collected works is the letters that he wrote with Barbaro on the relative merits of rhetoric and philosophy. After Padua, he may have gone to Florence. He may have gone to Paris. We don't know, but at some time during this intellectual journey, he did spend time probably twice in Florence, where he worked and studied under Ficino and learned about Platonism. And he also studied at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he became friendly with members of the French court and got to know several intellectuals of the time, particularly Cordier, who later became important to him when he was accused of heretical ideas in conclusions that we'll come to in just a second. After Florence, or maybe before, he also was at the University of Pavia, where he was studying probably astrology, logic, issues such as this, maybe maths as well, which he was famous for at the time. Then he ends up in 1486. I'm thinking modern here. In 1486, are in the Florence area, and at that point, he's determined to start writing his own works, and to get involved in philosophy more particularly. He's under some stress, because at the same time he's met a girl. Unfortunately, the girl is married to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
He attempts to abduct her, and it's an all-out kind of brawl. He brings a band of guys, and the husband brings a band of guys. A bunch of people are killed. The girl, the woman, Margarita, is taken back.
Mm-hmm.
Pico is in disgrace. The Golden Prince is kind of looking a little bit sullied.
Mm-hmm.
He, as far as we know, never gets involved with the girl again. Who knows? But that seems to be it. The abduction, nobody really knows why or what happened, whether it was willing or not. But after that, people start sort of writing to him saying, well, when are you going to get settled down and have a real profession? You know, as the younger son of nobility, the real profession would have been getting involved with politics, hanging out at a major court like the Medici, maybe, you know, acting on behalf of somebody. And he says, no, I'm going to be a philosopher. But a philosopher is somebody, you know, like Ficino, who has to live hand to mouth. He has to teach. He has to get patronage from people like Pico, frankly, who have the money. So Pico creates this whole new category that he calls a gentleman philosopher. And he asserts, because he's good at asserting, that only gentlemen can be philosophers, because it requires a contemplative life and you shouldn't be grubbing around for money. And so you should be able to retreat to the study and focus on being a philosopher and living the life of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, you know, that's still a dodgy thing to argue to your family and friends when your family and friends are the Medici, Este, Sforzas, etc. Basically the power brokers of Italy. And so he plans this big coming out as a philosopher during this year. And his idea, his vision, is that he's going to blow up the entire world of philosophy and the entire Catholic Church at once, and thereby cause a reform of the Catholic Church and change the way people perceive philosophy. And he's going to do so by arguing in front of the Pope and a bunch of cardinals, probably. That's what he's thinking of. A series of conclusions, and he's going to do it in the so-called Paris fashion, where you have a series of questiones, you have a series of like thesis statements that you debate publicly with all comers. And he creates this extraordinary number of statements that he is going to debate. And there's 900 of them. Mm-hmm. So can you imagine, I mean, anybody who's been through like, having to defend a dissertation, can you imagine if you had 900 thesis statements that you were going to, do your viva voce for? So that's what he was proposing. And he said he was going to do it. I hope I'm getting my dates right here. I'm in the post weekend. I'm in a date bad moment. It was 1487 on the Feast of Epiphany, which is, of course, the beginning of the time when the pagan kings came to supplicate the baby Jesus. Mm-hmm. And because there's an alternative idea here, which is not only is he going to reform the Catholic Church, but he is going to convert all of paganism to Christianity. Because his arguments are going to be so compelling that it's the beginning of mass conversion. Mm. So this is going to change everything. This is his idea. And he's going to change everything by the 900 conclusions essentially go from contemporary thought in his time all the way back and back and back and back to what he considers to be original revelation.
Okay.
And he is going to essentially go through all of the conundrums of the church of the day and then take it back level by level by level, working through the conundrums back to Plato and Aristotle, show how you can work through those conundrums and unify and unify and unify till you get back to that singularity, which is the point at which God revealed mystery to the world. And then the second half of the conclusions, if that wasn't enough, is that then it's a proposing forward in many respects.
Does he say how far he's going to go specifically?
It goes through the same levels, essentially. So, you go on this journey, which if you were talking about Ficino, it would be the Prisca Major or the Prisca Theologia, back from scholasticism all the way through to that direct revelation. And here is the interesting and definitive, or one of the definitive points about Pico, is that point of singularity is the direct revelation of God to Moses. That is the point, the starting point of the Prisca Theologia. I suppose you could also say it was to Adam too, but it's the same revelation. And that is known, he considers that to be Kabbalism as expressed in Jewish mysticism.
So does he include in his own Prisca Theologia thought there, does he include moments which he considers to be revelation but weren't considered perhaps Orthodox revelation with respect to the Catholic Church? Figures maybe such as Hermes or, these sorts of figures. Does he include these within the revelation as well?
He did. You've got Hermes Trismegistus, you've got Zoroastrianism through the Chaldean Oracles. You've also got Orphic hymns, you've got Pythagorean ideas, the whole caboodle's in there. But he also says later, by the way, in his life, that maybe he got caught up on some of these. So a bit like Ficino did not always have the same Prisca Theologia, and I think that we discussed that before. So Pico, I am not clear whether you could say that all of them had the same importance to him throughout his entire career. He was very into the Chaldean Oracles during 1486. In part because the person who was teaching Hebrew to him, who was his secretary, Flavius Mithridates, who also, by the way, was the main translator for the Kabbalistic works that Pico read during that time and that formed the foundation of his Kabbalistic conclusions. Flavius also was pushing what he called Chaldean, as a second language for Pico to learn, and was that he said this was a secret language, and that Pico was very, very special and that he was going to get to learn it, and he wouldn't allow Pico's friend Girolamo Benediene to learn it too because it was special. And of course, Pico was an absolute sucker for anything like this. I mean, if it was special and elite and it led to secrets, then he was all in. So I don't know whether it's that, I mean, obviously it wasn't Chaldean. I believe it was a form of Aramaic that was being taught. But Pico later says, well, I kind of got caught up on some of this Egyptian and Chaldean stuff, and maybe that's, that we should think about Christianity first.
Okay.
So it's difficult to judge really how much of that was a later influence, but it's certainly there in all the works around the early stage. Yeah.
So what happens with these theses? Does this defense ever happen?
Oh God, no. So he arrives in Rome in December, very excited. He's about to, transform the history of the world.
Absolutely,
Bless
of course.
him.
Yeah.
He's at that point, he's what? I'm trying to remember. He's in his early 20s. So he turns up. Immediately, he publishes this. and he publishes a challenge to any philosopher in Italy or wherever to come and debate with him. And because he's got a ton of money, he also says he'll pay for all the, coming to Rome, etc. Well, of course, the papal court get wind of this and think, what is this? Start reading through and says, oh, hang on a second here. What are you going to do? And what is this? And they start to hold commissions looking at the different conclusions. And they say, no, you can't have this debate while we investigate. So this goes on over months. So Pico is literally cooling his heels in Rome, getting increasingly frustrated. And the first commission looks and says, there's something wrong here. And we think about 13 of the 900, by the way. 13 might be a problem. Let's look at those in more detail. And so then they have another commission. I think in all there's about 3 commissions. And then it gets 2 commissions and then gets handed over to the Inquisition. And the commission that looks at it with more focus, particularly the 13. And when you think about it, I will say as a side note that he was incredibly lucky, given what we've just discussed, that it was only 13 of 900.
Yeah.
And it is very, very interesting. And I don't think it's been discussed much in scholarship, why the church didn't go after all the others.
Do you think there might have been some money exchanging hands there?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't. I mean, because when you consider it, they were more interested in the things that seemed to directly conflict with, say, for example, notions of the sacrament taken from Thomas Aquinas, as an example, rather than, well, why are we talking about Orphic hymns? Which is a more central question.
I guess they almost had no structure. There was, how do we even begin to deal with this? Because we haven't seen this, even questioned in such a long time. Whereas the other stuff, you'd have this clear Thomistic foundation where you go, look, we can spot the confliction easily, whereas we don't know anything about Orphic hymns, so we don't even know where to start.
I don't know. or maybe it was the Orphic hymns. Orphic hymns were okay as long as one understood that there was a direct revelation from Christ afterwards. But it does go back to the question of why Ficino didn't get into more trouble with some of this stuff. And looking forward, because as I mentioned to you before, right now I've been doing some work on Bruno. It's almost that Bruno's case had to establish that heliocentrism was heresy in order for then Galileo to be accused of something. And I'm not saying, obviously they didn't prepare the Bruno case in order to bring a case against Galileo. But until that point, nobody had sat around and said, well, hang on a second, heliocentrism, heretical or not. But because they did eventually look at all those issues with Bruno and they came to some conclusions, then they knew what they were doing with Galileo. But when Copernicus came out, they weren't sitting around wondering if that was heretical. So it is interesting how these things go through. They almost have to go through a process. So I don't know, but I think it's very interesting.
If you were to perhaps try give an answer now, why is it that Ficino and Pico weren't burnt at the stake, whereas Bruno was? I guess there's so many different reasons. Do you think there's also reasons of biography there, though? Bruno was, as I understand it, quite a bombastic, outspoken character, whereas perhaps Ficino and Pico would have known when to take a little step back.
Oh, the lovely thing about Pico is that he absolutely did not know when to step. And he is just as bombastic as Bruno. And in many respects, I have to sort of disassociate one from the other, because sometimes they become, you start thinking, well, my goodness, what is the relationship between bombasticism and Renaissance philosophy? And, and you even see somebody like Paracelsus, who it's almost like part of his name. Well, it is part of his name. So Pico was definitely bombastic. Ficino managed to avoid a lot of this, particularly by trying to make relationships with the right people, by being in the right place. Florence, he was protected by the Medici family. He seemed to skirt the line, and I think he was also sufficiently appreciated because of his work on Plato, and he did have an excellent reputation across the whole of Italy, including in Rome, that he somehow avoided this type of scrutiny. Pico did not avoid this type of scrutiny. He put himself in the way. He refused to back down when these commissions were happening. In fact, he went in and argued with them. And basically, I think it was in February of 1487, they actually told him he was no longer welcome at the commissions. So you can imagine, he was probably in there, like, telling them all they were complete idiots.
Well, obviously.
And, they basically said, right, you're not coming anywhere near this anymore. He had people in the commission, though, who were his friends. People like Cordier was in the commission, but he was up against some real, increasingly extreme religious thinkers who were very anti-Pico. And they, in the end, won. It was almost like the US Supreme Court. They got to write the decision, and they're the ones who got it moved over to the Inquisition. But Cordier was trying to help Pico, and probably it was quite helpful for Pico not to be allowed in the commissions anymore. So basically, he took to his bed, the story goes. The ambassador to Florence wrote to Lorenzo de' Medici, who obviously was a friend of Pico's and knew Pico well, saying that, our young friend, is taken to his bed and refuses to get up because he's so sick and tired of the whole business. So this kind of went on until about July, at which point the Pope, Innocent, decided that he'd had enough of all of this. The Inquisition said this was heretical, and he was going to make Pico withdraw the conclusions. And Pico didn't want to withdraw the conclusions. But eventually he agreed that with the Pope, that they would condemn the book, but not him, which is a wonderful nicety. And, Bruno should have been so lucky from that point of view. So a bull was issued to condemn the book as heretical, and it was to be burnt at the stake, which, by the way, it's such a lovely idea, right? You burn the book at the stake, not the person at the stake. And Pico would meanwhile, get off, shall we say, as long as he didn't try to do this again. But the bull was not published. And it wasn't published until, I'm trying to remember, I think it was December. Now, why wasn't it published? Well, I think the answer might lie in the fact that Innocent eventually published the bull in December, and at the same time issued a warrant for Pico's arrest. So I suspect what happened was that they thought they got an agreement from Pico that the book would be condemned, but Pico would get away with it. But Pico maybe retracted, and Pico said, no, I'm standing by my book. And maybe the whole thing went on for a few more months until Innocent finally said, right, both of you, I'm getting the book and I'm getting you. And that was just a few weeks after Pico had finally realized that he had put himself in a very, very dangerous position. And he escaped for France. So he has friends in France. He escapes. The Pope issues a warrant for his arrest and has papal nuncios run after him. They do catch up with him. The papal arrest warrant is perfectly good in France. So a member of the nobility captures Pico, hands him over to the papal nuncios. This is not looking like a good story so far. But luckily for Pico, He's a nobleman. He's got friends all over the place, and he spent time in Paris. And so they take him to Paris, where he comes under the protection of Charles VIII of France, who basically says, "Oh, don't worry," to the papal nuncios, "I'll look after him," and puts him in, I'm using air quotes here, prison in the Palace of Vincennes, where he stays for a little while, probably getting the royal treatment, until Lorenzo de' Medici can intervene on his behalf with the Pope. And so basically the entire friendship network of Pico comes into play. And everybody's putting pressure on the Pope to back off. And eventually Pope Innocent backs off. He allows Pico to come back and live, but only in Florence for the time being. And he is excommunicated. So Pico lives in Florence, but in fact doesn't. I mean, he goes all over the place. And Lorenzo gives him somewhere to live in Fiesole, just outside of Florence. From then onwards, Pico supposedly uses uses Florence as a base. Innocent is constantly petitioned by Lorenzo to take back the excommunication. He refuses. He eventually dies, and it's down to the Borgia Pope, who's a little bit more sympathetic to a lot of Pico's ideas, including having an interest in Kabbalism, and he reverses the excommunication finally. So I mean, it's a narrow escape for Pico. And I'd say the difference between Pico and Bruno in this case is that Pico has the advantage of class.
He has all those networks and friends, and
exactly.
Okay. So, wow. I mean, so how come he died so young? Is there any specific reason for this, or is this just
He dies so young because he's probably murdered. And by this time, and I promised I would walk a middle ground, but by this time, you've probably got the idea here that he does make enemies. Though that later life in Florence, there isn't so much of a sign of him doing that. But I mean, who knows? He dies within about a month of his best friend, Angelo Poliziano. They both die under suspicious circumstances. They both die at a very suspect moment in the history of Florence. Essentially, Lorenzo's died. He's left the rulership of Florence to Piero, his son, who is not doing a good job. Meanwhile, Charles VIII is coming down from France because he's having a dispute with the Kingdom of Naples. And basically, he's marching into Italy to show the Kingdom of Naples who's who and what the pecking order should be. And he is basically taking everything in his path. And he is descending on the territory, the Florentine territory. Meanwhile, Pico and some of his friends, including Benevieni, who I've already mentioned, and also Poliziano, they are still interested in church reform, and they invite in an old friend of theirs, probably from the Ferrara days, a preacher called Girolamo Savonarola, who is the Dominican friar, who's established a reputation for preaching, particularly in a kind of penitential ascetic form, and for very loudly proposing the penitence of sinners, and because of the church needs reforming and paganism needs to be, the pagans need to be converted, etc., etc. And they have put upon Lorenzo before he died, inviting Savonarola to establish a foothold at the Dominican church in Florence. And finally, Lorenzo says, okay, invites Savonarola. Then Lorenzo dies. Savonarola becomes increasingly influential in Florence. Piero's doing a terrible job. The King of France is advancing. Savonarola says that the King of France is God's judgment on Florentines and on Piero, and that, he is now God's prophet. Savonarola is God's prophet, and he prophesies that, Charles is going to come in and usher in a new era of penitence for Florence. There is unrest. In Florence, Piero flees. Charles is sitting just outside of Florence. Savonarola is waiting in the wings to essentially become the eminence grise of the newly re-established rule of the Signoria of the full Republican council in Florence. And mysteriously, Poliziano dies, and then Pico dies. And Pico dies on the very day that Charles enters Florence.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, Savonarola says, look, I am the prophet of God. Everything I've said has come true. And despite the fact that Pico was a big hero in Florence, at Pico's funeral, Savonarola felt powerful enough to say to everybody that he'd had a vision, and that Pico was not in heaven, because he was a sinner too, and he hadn't lived a truly St. Pico type life, and that he was actually enduring the flames of purgatory at that very moment, which was pretty horrific. So fast forward to, I'm going to say it was 2010, 2012. There'd always been these stories around Pico's death and Poliziano's death. And also I should mention that there were stories that Poliziano and Pico were also in a relationship, a physical relationship, as well as a friendship, who knows. They dug up the bones of Pico and Poliziano, and they did find poisoning. I'm trying to remember now. I believe it was arsenic. And so they both are put down as probable murders. But by who? Don't know. But it's a really interesting question.
Wow.
Yeah.
I guess we'll never know.
Well, I mean, you can say that, but the lovely thing about scholarship is that you're always coming up with new pieces of paper, new manuscripts, stuff in libraries that hasn't been read before, palimpsests where you get to see new texts, archaeology, so never say never. Right now, nobody knows. There is a suggestion that it was Pico's secretary, but, under the payment of Piero. But as I said, who knows? People have got lots of great ideas. So it's just one of those wonderful historical murder stories right now.
So with respect to all of this, I mean, did Pico consider himself, a devout Catholic?
Did he consider himself a devout Catholic?
Yeah, I mean, so he has this, he wants to really take the church to court in a way of some form of reform. So what's his relationship there? I mean, he clearly sees a lot of, were there some key problems or a key problem that he it's quite a strange relationship to be devout, to believe in it, to believe in the church, but then on the other hand go, I believe in you, but I'm also going to come to Rome and tell you what's what. So yeah, what were the key problems for him, I guess?
I think probably, I mean, he doesn't discuss this too much, but certainly when you look at the people that he was drawn to, they definitely belong to a more kind of ascetic penitential branches of the church. So probably we are talking about issues that also maybe Luther was complaining about. I mean, it's part of a general concern that that the way things were going in the world suggested that the church had become split. And we could talk about, the defeat of the Byzantine Empire, the division between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism. You could talk about the fact that the Turks were clearly being victorious and were encroaching on the Christianized Latin West. That these were all signals that something had gone wrong, and that we needed to rethink, and that we needed penitence, and we needed maybe to go back to earlier revelation. And as I said, he saw that revelation, obviously not just through the words of Jesus, but also through that direct revelation that was signified by particularly Kabbalism, but also in other traditions, or filtered through other traditions. I get that impression. He doesn't necessarily write something that says this is what's wrong with the church. This still needs to change. I do think he is a strange mixture at times between a return to a medieval form of mysticism, which I find very different to Ficino, for instance, and a kind of reform and return to a Prisca theologia that you do find in Ficino. So it's a kind of a weird mixture, which I think is also there in his education, between a deep interest in Averroes and Aristotelianism, between things that we would recognize in Caesar Dionysius and in the later mystics, Meister Eckhart, etc. That they're all there, and I think that's why he promotes a more individual, an individual ascent to divinity when he thinks about his own route, his own spirituality. He's not out there proposing that we're all going to go on a mystical journey and then return to reform the world. He very much is about personal ascent. However, I think there is a genuine dichotomy here between that earlier push of the 900 conclusions and that later discussion around, and also parallel discussion around ascent. And that is something that I haven't yet been able to put together. Maybe I should just delineate that a bit more clearly. So far we have focused on the 900 conclusions, which is this grandiose project to reform the world, to convert pagans, particularly Jews, by the way, and thereby initiate also the end of the world and salvation, the salvatory process. But at the same time, there is also a conversation around the pursuit of philosophy as a way of beginning a pursuit of the spiritual pursuit and the ability to ascend into a closer relationship with God. Now, those two pieces come together very clearly, I think, in Ficino's work. The relationship between reform of the world and the ascent to unio mystica, or at least a glimpse of the divine. Because in Ficino, it's about you go up and then you come down again. And that because with that insight, you're able to bring reform. Whereas in Pico, that never really resolves to my mind. So you have this idea that you will see in the oration that he wrote as the kind of, should we say, preface to his conclusions. He wrote this oration that he's going to go out there and deliver before he defends 900 conclusions in front of the Pope. In the oration, that discussion of how does one move from philosophy, what's the point of philosophy, all the way up to ideas of the unio mystica in his perspective. But there is no particular reversal. There's no descent. There's no way of saying, okay, well then, how do we then take that mystical experience that is achieved for a first step of philosophy and use that as our way of converting, of changing the world?
Do you think, I mean, I see that there as Ficino and Pico both working in the Platonist tradition. Ficino has his, he seems to emphasize on the free will aspect, that you exit the cave, you get the knowledge, but then emphatically you have to do the horrible thing of returning to the cave. Do you think for Pico that ultimately his elitism gets in the way and he exits the cave and then he thinks, well, actually, I'd quite like to keep this knowledge for myself and and for the nobles?
I think there is a deep divide in his work, and I am not sure how to put it together. And I promised the middle way. It's very tempting to say, James, yes, you're absolutely correct. But I'm not sure. And part of the problem with Pico is that because he did die young, and he talks all his life about three major projects that he's working on: a poetic theology, the conclusions, and a concordance between Plato and Aristotle. So from that perspective, he apparently only fulfilled one of the three, and he was working on the other two. He was also working on a major work on astrology when he died. Now, it's not clear whether the poetic theology was also the concordance, so it could be that I'm getting that wrong. It's not completely clear whether it was three, but that's how one may read it. So maybe there were more answers in those greater work, in that greater work, but we don't have it, and so it's really unknown. But it is very interesting to me that the Eurasians sit side by side with this grand project to change the church and to convert Judaism. So do we say that he tried it, he got his fingers burnt, and then he decided to focus on himself? Or do we say, well, hang on a sec, because he's also talking about it in the Eurasian, the individual ascent. So do we say that, in fact, it was always more about the individual ascent? Or do we say that there's a real gap here? I think there's a gap. And I would like to think about that in a scholarly way, rather than just saying, oh, it's because we don't have all his stuff, so we don't know. But ultimately, it could be that we just don't know because we don't have all this stuff. But I would say that we need to look more closely and delve more deeply into some of those conversations. There's some weird stuff that just is not resolved. So if I may, and I another one that annoys the hell out of me because I don't know how to resolve it is in Being and the One. He basically dismisses Parmenides as a rhetorical exercise that Plato really didn't believe in. Now, Parmenides is in the early constitutions, the early sort of hierarchies of Plato's texts, considered the numero uno. It's number one. It is the most important. It's the one that you go to after you've developed yourself philosophically and spiritually through all the others. You end up with the Parmenides. So that is an extraordinary thing for him to say. So why does he say it? It begs the question. And I think a lot of people who work on Pico, there are so many rabbit holes you can go down. And you're constantly torn in two different directions. Do you really go for it and go down that rabbit hole and essentially try to explain something that really isn't explainable? Or say, well, you know what? It's fragmented scholarship and the guy was really elitist. So, you know. Speaking
of rabbit holes, there is one I most definitely want to go down, which is why Kabbalism was so important. Because, you know, in my own research into various thinkers of the past, Kabbalism is always the rabbit hole where you go, okay, now we're about to go off the rails. So why? And it's always the deepest rabbit hole as well. And it never ends. It's connected to hundreds.
Really?
Yeah, I've always found it. I was sometimes, I didn't with your book, but sometimes I'll brush over sections which are on Kabbalism with respect to certain things because you just think I don't really know how to hold on to the ride at this point. But what is Pico's relationship with Kabbalism? Because this seems to be one of the clearer differences between, but Pico. It seemed to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that Ficino and Pico's overarching structure of the universe with respect to Platonism is mostly alike, but with Pico there was this aspect of Kabbalism where there was a very clear difference, that this is something more important for him.
I think that's one of the major differences. I mean, yeah, I could pull on a bunch of differences, but this certainly was a big one. Ficino did use Kabbalism, but it was had a more minor role for him. So Pico was introduced to Kabbalism, we don't know by who. Could have been Medigo, could have been Flavius Mithridates, but probably, I suspect, Medigo. Medigo wasn't a Kabbalist himself. I mean, that wasn't his thing, particularly, as I said, Averroist philosopher. But he certainly would have known about it and may have recommended texts to Pico. Flavius came along later. So Pico went out with a bunch of people's help. He got a book list and started to collect works on Kabbalism. So somebody or other sold him the idea that Kabbalism was really interesting. Kabbalism starts from a kind of a mythical concept, essentially, that these are books of revelation that were handed directly to Moses by God. So it's the stuff that wasn't written down. Well, it was written down, but it was separate books, essentially. So we have three branches of Judaism. We've got, to be really kind of blunt about it, we can get into all the niceties, but to be blunt, we've got three. We've got the Torah itself. We've got the Talmud, and the oral law, which starts to be written down, the Talmud is. And then we have Kabbalism, which is based on this direct revelation that was given to Moses that was written down by Ezra. So these are mythical works, essentially, the mythical books from Ezra. And so it's a direct revelation that was given to Moses that may also have been given to now, that's what Pico believed. And so that's what made it special for him, because it connects it connects to the idea of direct revelation. And of course, Jesus is direct revelation. So if we go back to Ficino's idea, you have the Prisca Theologia, then you have Jesus, which is direct revelation from God, and everything afterwards is interpretation. You don't need any more direct revelation, right? So if you look at Pico, he is saying, well, there's another direct revelation that happens even earlier. And this is really important because Christians are the heirs to Israel. So they're the new Israelites. So essentially, Kabbalism was the first revelation that was given to the Israelites. Jesus is the second revelation, and then everything else is in between. So it puts a primacy into Kabbalism. Now, was Kabbalism actually that? Well, of course not. It was a movement that was based on earlier Jewish mystical thought, and also mystical thought and philosophy that was coming in from all other directions. So in many respects, you can think of Kabbalism's history as being just like the Prisca Theologia, because it's basically the same people keep popping up. So when you look at Kabbalistic thought, you will see Pythagoreanism in its earlier aspects, in its neo aspects. You're going to see Middle Platonism, later Platonism. You're going to see Philo of Alexandria. You're going to see later discussions around the Second Temple of Jewish mysticism. You're going to see Mahava, which is chariot mysticism, which is nobody's quite sure when that started, but let's throw out the 3rd century. Maybe it goes back to Philo, not sure. You're going to see Hekkalot literature, which is another wonderful early form of Jewish mysticism, which is around the idea of visiting palaces, which is inhabited by angelic beings. You know, there's all these different concepts. You've got the legends of Enoch, you've got the legend of Elijah, you've got Ezekiel's vision of God, which is this chariot from which the Mahava mysticism emerges. So, I mean, Jewish religion has a wonderful history of layers and layers and layers of mystic practices and also philosophical inputs. And it connects, unsurprisingly, with the different milieus that it was in, whether it was Alexandria, which is such a melting pot, or whether it was Rome, or whether it was in Israel itself, or whether it was in during sojourns in Babylon. You know, you've got the whole, as I said earlier, the whole kit and caboodle in there in different forms. So unsurprisingly, Pico looks at it and says, oh, goodness me, this like connects with everything, you know, and I can see all these different connections, and I can see that, in fact, Kabbalism could easily be the root of it all. Whereas Kabbalism, in many respects, is the crown of, sorry to take a Kabbalistic analogies here, it just came to mind. It's like the leaves on the tree. Mm-hmm. You know, the tree itself is this amazing history of all sorts of things coming to play. But where does the actual leaves, the thing that we call Kabbalism, emerge? Nobody's quite sure. But Gershom Scholem, who was like somebody who really turned around the scholarship of Kabbalism in the 20th century, he suggests that it actually grew up in Languedoc, interestingly, in the same milieu, the same place, and at the same time as Catharism, which is highly suggestive. And I talk in the book about the relationship to Gnosticism, because Catharism is obviously very much related to Gnostic ideas. I would hesitate these days to kind of, I used Gnosticism in the book as a kind of metonym for this whole thing. I'm not sure I would, in retrospect, have done the same now. Mm-hmm. But let it be, let it stand for this whole kind of hodgepodge of Middle Platonism, mystical ideas, late Platonism that kind of goes into Jewish mysticism and Christianity and emerges as Catharism and as Kabbalism. So it starts off there with a family, particularly around a character called Isaac the Blind, Scholem suggests, and move very rapidly over the mountains to Girona, Kingdom of Aragon. And so there's a Geronese influence there, and then moves across Spain, and then into Italy, Crete, across the Jewish world. It also connects with the Sephardi Golden Age in Moorish Spain, in Andalusia and southwards. And also connects at some point with the greatest Jewish philosopher of that period, who is Moses Maimonides, who I would, let's say, he's the Averroes of Jewish philosophy, in the sense that he was really taken with by Aristotle, and tried to connect Aristotle to Jewish religion, to Judaism, and in doing so tried that reconciliation of faith and reason that Averroes saw him do himself as doing between Aristotle and Islam when he recovered Aristotle in the 12th century. So Maimonides lectured all over the place. In fact, I was in Fez a few years back and saw a plaque, a Medina, where you can see Maimonides lectured in one of the schools in Fez. So he was all over Moorish Spain and became very important elsewhere. At the beginning, Maimonides was rejected by Kabbalism, but did eventually become assimilated, particularly through a messianic branch of Kabbalism that was started by a character called Abulafia. And he really connected Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, which is an Aristotelian sort of Jewish mishmash, and he connected it to Kabbalistic ideas. So not only did Pico manage to get that whole Prisca Theologia represented to him, when he read people like Abulafia, he was also getting Kabbalism revisioned through aspects of later Aristotelianism. So you can see why he thought he'd hit the jackpot.
Most definitely.
I hope that wasn't too much.
Well, that was a brief history of Kabbalism. I was impressed. Maybe it is, okay. It isn't such of a rabbit hole as I first thought. I think maybe the way it's been used in a lot of modern esotericism tends to skew it into this convoluted thing that just goes all over the place.
Well, I mean, if we go into the actual text and everything, yeah, it's going to go all over the place. Partly because it is all the concepts that you find are going to be connected to all these other things. And that is the rabbit hole in many respects.
Okay. Well, so we've covered the theses, we've covered his life, we've touched a little bit on Kabbalism there, we've looked into Ficino, the conclusions, Platonism, God, the Pope. I mean, is there anything key about Pico? I mean, there's obviously much more, but is there anything key about Pico and his life and his work that you'd like to add in?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think there's a lot of really interesting unresolved questions around Pico. Some of the things that he really brings to the surface because of his attempt at concordance, and so that is where I think I would like to put some emphasis. He, in seeking to try and tie all of these things together, this became his life's work in many respects. So what he started with the conclusions goes on. And to the end of his days, he's working on that concordance and trying to bring these pieces together and show people how they fit together. Now, he does not persuade, but he invites. So what I say in my book is that, ironically, in trying to bring things together, he reveals ruptures. He reveals the things that don't work. Because in Ficino, you get this wonderful overall vision of the universe and of our place in it. It's often hard to untie in Ficino what belongs where and what might not really fit. Whereas in Pico, it's very, very upfront because he's trying to sort of like say, okay, this person says this person says that. How do we put it together? He's not saying it. Unfortunately, he's not quite saying it like that. It's not as easy, but he is trying to make some very visible connections that then make you sort of say, well, hang on a sec, that doesn't fit. So one good example of this would be the relationship between emanation and creation. How can you have, on the one hand, a Christian creation in time, ex nihilo, and an emanation that is always happening and that doesn't necessarily start from in time, and has matter to work from, so it's not ex nihilo. Because of the nature of prime matter. So how do you relate those two? So it's only when Pico starts trying to provide an explanation that you start thinking, hang on a second, that doesn't work. Another example is the ongoing conversation that you find from Timaeus onwards between God and God. So in Timaeus, in Plato's Timaeus, you don't know who is doing the creating, who's fashioning the universe. It could be the thing from which it could be the thing is looking at itself and creating the image, right? Or it could be the demiurge character. So immediately you have this kind of problematic dichotomy. And that is something that is debated over and over again in the history of Platonic philosophy, right? And also in mysticism, whether it's Christian mysticism, and you find it again in Jewish mysticism, because, and this is what Pico focuses on, because you've got this problematic relationship between an apophatic God and a cataphatic God, between a God that is everything and overflowing, and that you can say things about, and a God that is hidden and that is nothing, is the naught, that you can say nothing about. So, he takes Kabbalism and discusses it, but really, in many respects, it's the same conversation that has been going on since Timaeus between the one and the demiurge. Is the demiurge the one? Are they both ones? And that is where Pico kind of ends up. We end up with actually two ones. But it's the one that he's playing with, that he doesn't resolve. But he brings to the fore this conversation. And you start thinking, hang on a second, isn't this all the same conversation? And there's something really rather provocative here. The same with the question of being. Is being in the one, or does being come after the one? So his text, his pamphlet, Being in the One, argues that being is in the one, right? That it's part of the one. But essentially, that is really problematic, because if being is in the one, then it's not one anymore, it's two. And if being, then it also means the one exists, which means it places it into the positive theological realm, right?
Yeah.
So what is the one he's talking about in Being in the One, which is why you end up with potentially this idea of dual ones. Then another one that he really raises to the surface is the problem of the Aristotelian active intellect. And I find this fascinating because I think it connects beautifully with the debate between Plotinus and later Platonists on the notion of the mind and the universal mind. Are you aware of the problematic piece in Aristotle's De Anima around the active intellect?
No.
I know everybody sits around debating it all the time, right? But it's about essentially the difference between Plato and Aristotle, where you have Plato says there's a world of forms. And so everything that you see in the natural world, it derives from the forms. Yeah. And so the mind is simply needs to be drawn back to the world of forms in order to understand what the idea is. Whereas, so you have to withdraw from the world to understand the world. Let me put it that way. Whereas Aristotle says, no, you determine what is above by looking at what is below. So you draw together the particulars and your mind works on them. And from that, you start to make decisions, assumptions around what are universal categories, right? What does it mean? And you start putting the pieces of the jigsaw together. You create species and then genus, etc., right? So two very, very different ways of looking at the world. But then you've got a problem because Aristotle also says in De Anima that there is something called the active intellect, which is essentially almost like a godlike mind, which gets to see everything. It reminds me a little bit of that dispute with Bishop Berkeley, right? You know, if the tree falls in the forest and nobody is there to see it, does it fall? Or does it make a sound, right? And then the answer is God is there to see. So that is actually the old debate between the active intellect and the general intellect of an individual person. And so there is a debate all the way through, you know, about this section in De Anima. You know, is there such a thing as an active intellect, which would mean a divinity and a, if you were relating it to Plotinus, for instance, I mean, he's not talking about an intellect per se, he's talking about the one, but it is a transcendent one. It is a one that hasn't come down into our souls. So it's a very similar discussion at some level. And so that kind of, is there an active intellect in the soul? Is the active intellect only in the second hypostasis, or Aristotle would say, you know, up there? Actually, I'm not quite sure where he decided to put it precisely. Or do we have two active intellects, or is the active intellect just in the soul? And so Pico really brings that to the fore again in some interesting ways.
It makes me think that maybe Pico studies, with knowing what we know he was intending to write, maybe at times Pico studies must be quite disappointing. Not in general, because you've got all this to work with, but that it was there was this halt, and the fact that sometimes we don't know what people would have produced if they'd stayed alive, but he made it explicit. He said, I'm going to do this and this. And so there's this, oh, I really wish you'd seen this through, because it's clear you had the ability to do so as well. So there is this sort of disappointment of things left unfinished. As you said, he left it with the 2 ones. You think maybe he would have gone on to complete these things.
Well, I think, by the way, that's me who thinks it's 2. So I believe so, because of the relationship, of Keter with the Ein Sof that he posits. You know, I've done a paper that kind of outlines that. I probably should publish something on it, but I believe it's 2 ones, but in a very interesting way. Yes, I hear you. And I do think that goes back to the issue that you raised earlier, which is that, you know, in a way, Pico studies goes in 2 directions. People who are willing to take him at his word and are very, very excited and basically want to get into it to prove his point, essentially. And then what I'm trying to suggest is there is another path, which is to go into it with a little bit more skepticism and to see it more as, okay, let's pursue as far as we can pursue, but let's also take this as an opportunity, understand it as rupture in the way in which the medieval world and maybe some others have put things together, and give us the opportunity to maybe not try and get in Pico's skull as to what he's thinking, but to see this as a wider opportunity to debate issues that he's bringing to the fore. And that is what I am trying to suggest. And maybe I should think about saying that as coherently as possible. Because I do think it's something that we really don't hear about in Pico studies so much. I guess you asked me what else I would say about Pico. Maybe a parting shot is that the oration that I referred to, we haven't really discussed. And I think maybe some of your listeners will find that very strange, because it is, or it has been until very recently, considered the most important and influential thing that Pico wrote. And I think it went through something like 21 editions in the 20th century. It is, when people think about Renaissance philosophy, almost the quintessence. It's the text. And maybe because it's short as well. And it all sounds very dramatic, and it sounds very proto-modern, like, how great is man? Man is a wonderful thing. And, people used to get very, very excited about this text, declaring the dignity of man. And basically, they saw this as the royal high road to Descartes. Mm-hmm. And it's not. And there's been some really wonderful work in the late 20th century, early 21st century, really showing people clearly that the oration is actually about what is philosophy and what is it for? What does it do? It's not about the dignity of man. So I would leave with a few really interesting questions that do arise out of the oration that we haven't discussed, mm-hmm. which are other rabbit holes that I'm presently pursuing. Mm. The first is almost at the beginning of the oration. There was a discussion on human mutability. And this is something that has been put out there as part of this great, miracle of the human, that the fact that we are mutable. But what niggles away at me, and there's been some things written about this, but I really want to do more, and I've done a paper, but I'd love to do a lot more, is that the metaphors that Pico uses here of Proteus and the chameleon are actually pretty negative metaphors of mutability. They are certainly not positive. The best that could be said of them is that they are ambiguous, but they are potentially quite negative. So that's number one. And then, which then kind of, what does that all mean in terms of the ability of the human that Pico is discussing? The second point that I want to refer to, which is a major rabbit hole for everybody who thinks about Pico, particularly the oration, is the question of metempsychosis or transmigration or reincarnation, whichever particular word. They all mean something slightly different, but whichever particular word we want to use. Because he says in his work that because we're mutable, we can become beasts, animals, vegetables, angels. But what is he really saying here? And that's the big question. Mm. Is he saying that we will become those things? Or is he saying that we will become like those things? And that is a wonderful debate. And because he's also using Kabbalism quite heavily here, and Kabbalism does happily believe in transmigration of souls, there is a literalness to some of the material he is using, as well as, of course, in Platonic form. So anyway, I better stop there. There's still a lot more to discuss about Pico.
Mm. Where would you advise people to begin with Pico?
Well, I guess you've got to start with the oration if you haven't read it already. So start with the oration. Do not read it as a work on the dignity of man, but actually ask yourselves, what is this about? And work for it section by section. Almost try and do a little précis for yourself. What is this about? And you'll start to see some really interesting things going on in that text. Where would I go next? Heptaplus. To me, Heptaplus, we haven't discussed it here, but Heptaplus is the most satisfactory of all his texts because it's complete and he published it. And it's not 900 conclusions that you're not quite sure what he was trying to say with them. Heptaplus is an argued polemic. It concerns the creation of the world, and it is based on his anagogical approach to interpretation. And by the way, he also liked the use of Kabbalism because the Kabbalism focuses on anagogical interpretation. And so does Pico. And of course, that is the esoteric interpretive approach within Christian thought too. So it is an anagogical approach. He has a lot of fun with it. He uses a lot of Kabbalism. He's got Pythagoreanism. He's got Platonism. Everything's in there around the first chapters of Genesis, and he considered it a complete work. So you really feel you're holding something substantial there, and it is really, really interesting as a text.
Okay, sounds like two good starting points. I'll be sure to put a link for your book, Re-evaluating Pico, in the description below, and hopefully you'll come on back on again as your sort of hidden storehouse of Renaissance digressions and anecdotes and stories. It's fantastic. So, but thank you very much for coming on once again.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. It's so much fun to have these conversations. Thank you, James.